So, making bread. These are the things that you're going to need in order to make bread. First, you're going to need yeast, and you're just going to directly add it to some water. Then what the yeast is doing is that the yeast in the water is now alive, and it's growing, and it's eating some of the nutrients in the water, and it's going to proof, which is the words that we mean for when it creates carbon dioxide. So what we're doing now is we're adding flour to the mixing bowl. This is going to be 1/2 cup right away here. And so what we're doing now is adding sugar. And so what we're doing now is we're waiting for the yeast to proof, and we're attaching the dough hook. The dough hook is important because it helps knead the bread while also mixing it. So you can see on the right that the water with the yeast in it is bubbling up, and the yeast has started to look a little foamy. And so that's how you know that the yeast is proofing. And we're pouring the yeast in. As you can see, the yeast and the water are pretty well mixed by this point, and so you know that they're proofed. And so immediately after adding in the yeast and your 3/2 cups of flour, you're going to pour in 2 more cups of water. So the entire process is going to take 6 total cups of flour, but adding them by halves, you're going to need 12 halves. And so if you look at the yeast, flour, water mixture, you'll see that there's bubbles forming already, and that's really important to the bread. So basically, as I add more flour here, I'm going to describe the process that the yeast goes through in order to create the carbon dioxide and the oxygenation inside of the bread. So basically what you can picture it as is the flour has a bunch of little nutrients inside it that helps the new plants grow. And so originally when you have the wheat, you're grinding up this flour, and the flour is ground up, and so all those nutrients are crushed down, but they're still there. And so when you add the yeast to the flour, the yeast just starts eating all those nutrients, and it transforms them into pockets of carbon dioxide, as well as other flavors that we really like in our bread. And so the carbon dioxide that it releases is really what makes your bread poof up. And so we'll see that later when we watch it rise. As you can see, there's starting to be some strips in the bread. And that is because there is the fibers of the flour and the fibers of the yeast are bonding together, and you're stretching them out. And so they pull against each other and they tear. So what we're doing here is we're adding another 1/2 cup of flour into the mixture, just so that it won't stick to my hands as badly, but also so that we can flour the work surface. So as you can see, I'm picking up the bread and making sure that some of the flour gets underneath it. And then I'm folding it back into itself. So I'm stretching it out, pulling it apart, or pulling it together. And so what the yeast does is that it loosens it up. So it's like when you go to sleep at night, sort of. And so then when you're kneading the dough, it's sort of like going for a run or working out, lifting weights. You're making your muscle tighter. And so what I just did here is I added this dough to a greased bowl. The greased bowl is important just to make sure that it doesn't stick to the edges. And so after that, I'm going to add this piece of cloth to cover the dough. And then I'm going to wait for it to rise. And so after it's risen for a while, I'm going to take it out, and as you can see, it's filled up this entire bowl. I'm going to plop it onto this baking sheet. So the first thing that you're going to want to do when you're shaping your bread is you're going to cut it into 2 pieces, because this one is probably too big for a single loaf. Now you could have the recipe and you would get half as much, and you could make that a single loaf. But since we've made so much, I'm going to make it into 2. So what I'm going to do is set aside 1 and just begin working with the first one. So what you see me doing here is adding corn flour to the bottom, or cornstarch to the bottom, corn flour to the bottom of the baking pan, just so that the bread won't stick when it's in the oven. And so what I'm doing right now is I'm making a baguette-shaped bread. And so when you're leaving it on your baking sheet, it's going to rise for a second time. So you leave it on the baking sheet for about 45 minutes for the second time. And the first time when you let it rise, you could go anywhere from an hour to about 6. I mean, you could leave it for a whole day if you wanted to, but it takes a while then. So you're going to leave this on there after cutting these slits for about 45 minutes to an hour. You could go as short as 30 minutes, but it doesn't rise as well then in its shape. And so what we're doing is, after it's risen for a little bit, is we're adding it to the oven, and when it comes out, it becomes this baguette. So what's happening inside of this pill bottle right now is that the yeast is beginning to break down some of the nutrients inside of the sugar. As it does this, it's filling up the bottle and the balloon with carbon dioxide. The yeast builds up bread based on the power of a bunch of little small pockets of carbon dioxide. They're dispersed really evenly throughout the bread. Now, one thing that you can do to make the effectiveness of this experiment better is to have your yeast pill box be on a heated blanket. And the reason for that is because yeast grows best in an environment that is about 80 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit.